All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our brown bag session on logging today. My name is Lisa Carnes, and I'm one of the CSMs here at Sumo Logic, and I'm going to get things kicked off real fast here for us. Really quick, if you haven't been to one of our brown bag sessions before, we launched the series earlier this year, and we have them on the second, third, and fourth Tuesday of every month. And they're designed to provide opportunities for our customers to spend time with us in a more intimate setting for learning on key technical topics. And so today we have our logging session being led by one of our professional services consultants, Bhargavi. And as always, if you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat or the question and answer windows, and I'll be monitoring that for Bhargavi as we go along. And then at the very end, we'll also have time for questions and answers too. So without further ado, I will kick it off to Bhargavi.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. So I'm Bhargavi. I'm part of the professional services team here at Sumo. Please let me know anyways if you cannot hear me for whatever reason or see my screen. We were having a little bit of issues earlier. But yeah, I'm part of the professional services team here at Sumo. Been here at Sumo for around 4 years, and we're going to be going through a logging session as part of our CS Brown Bag initiative. So really want to make sure that this, this session gives you all that you want in terms of understanding logging. So in the chat, if you want to just let me know your familiarity level with logging in general, if you have any questions, right, that you want answered or your expectations from the session today, feel free to throw that in. I'll try to make sure I can cover it in respect to the agenda that we have set today. And without any further ado, I will get started. Now, the CS Brown Bag, sort of, as you might already know, sort of is just trying to make sure that this setting is a little bit more intimate, where you can have a little bit more questions being answered. You can change the course of, what are some of the topics you want answered. And that's where we have the Q&A and the chat session. So feel free to utilize it, right? This is meant for you to get more value from the sessions in general. And we're going to have a lot more coming up, of course. But today's session, as I mentioned, is about logging. And we're going to go through a variety of topics, but really it's going to be focused around how to improve your logging experience within the Sumo platform. So the sort of mindset that we're going to be taking to this approach is you have data flowing in. You set up your logs, you're bringing it in, but now you want to make sure that you're maximizing the experience within the Sumo Logic platform. So these are the tips and tricks, some of the things that you might already know, things you might not be aware of, things that we recommend as best practices when you're getting started with logging in any sort of sense, right? So the way we've broken this down is into 4 things, right? How do we navigate what a log query specifically is? What are the things that comprise of log queries, and how do we see that data coming in? How do we take advantage of things within the UI? Because not everyone is familiar with the query language. So there are things in the UI that make it much easier, especially when you're first starting off with the platform. We're not going to be spending too much time on the UI, but if there is something specific that you would like me to cover, I can definitely do that. The other ones are more about the performance optimizations. Now, performance is not going to be a topic that we handle just on its own. It's going to be interspersed with all the topics that we talk about, because most of the best practices we advocate for, whether they be metadata or processing, they all have that thread of making sure your performance within Sumo is good. So all of these best practices are to make sure you have the best performance for your queries. But on top of that, if you're still facing certain things, you've done all the metadata and everything, and you're still having issues, there are some other performance optimizations that can help improve that experience. And then finally, we're going to go through some pre-built queries. Now, what we talk about pre-built queries are, they're like templates, essentially. So we really want to make sure you understand where you can gain advantage from those templates, how you can use those queries in your own learning experience at Sumo. Now, without further ado, let's get going. Now, query basics. And while we're going through these topics, I'm going to be navigating to my demo environment within Sumo. to help walk you through where you can see these items and essentially be able to understand these topics with real live data, which is of course demo data. It's nothing like personal or sensitive, but we want to make sure that as we're talking about a topic, you can have an idea of how it looks in the UI. Now, as you have data flowing in, right, you have sources coming in, there's a lot of things that we expect the customer or the user to have set up to make their searching experience of that data easier. And the reason why it's so important is when you have the metadata in place, it makes writing queries that much easier. And that's where we have that concept of metadata, where we have data that's describing the data that's coming in, whether it's the type of data, the type of environment, the type of application. And then on top of that, we want to take all this unstructured data and we want to be able to create some type of structure, right? When you have data coming in, it's usually of some type of format. Logging best practices usually advocate that you have a log in a particular format. Now, let it be Apache logs, the vendor manages the log formats, or even your own application code. There's some type of logging format. And that's where we're going to use that logging format to create structure out of that log. So that's where we're going to use things like parsing expressions to create patterns out of logs, field extraction rules to take those patterns and solidify them into rules for your data. All right. So going through this exercise, these are the 5 important topics we're going to be talking about. First off being metadata, and then we're going to go into the rest. So if you go in to Sumo Logic, when you go into the manage data and the collection portion, this is where you can see all of your data, right? Now you can see there are certain things like source category. And if you hover over these, you have things like the collector name, the source name. So the collector here and underneath them have multiple sources. That is your metadata, nothing else. It's the way you've set up the collection. So if you were to click on one of these little blue icons, it's going to give you those metadata tags, source and collector. And this is essentially the data describing the data. You're going to see it in the UI everywhere as well, right? Like if you click on this, you can add, tags to describe that data. And that's what it is. It's tags to describe the data. Now, the reason why we talk about metadata so much at Sumo is if you think about it, and let's say you have a terabyte of data coming in, if you don't have the organization of your data sorted out, it can make the process of querying that data quite difficult. So when we talk about metadata, we talk about think of patterns on how you'd like to query the data. You don't have to throw every tag out there, but at least have an idea. So in this case, we can look at this particular collector, immediately know the region, right? You can see the source category, which tells you that these are observability logs. You can see Jenkins logs. So that's the general idea. Now, you have multiple metadata tags, and they each serve their own sort of purpose, right? This is the collector tag. And now let me get a better one here. Yeah, let's go off of the detection labs. So we have the collector. We have it describing the type of data that's going to be grouping all the sources underneath. We have each individual source. Now, we have also something called a source category, which is more of a customer defined tag where you can separate out different tags based off of, what that data is. So in this case, we know that it's detection lab data. If you want to throw an environment, you can maybe say production or whatnot. You can throw in the type of data. In this case, there's cloud data, there's network data, authentication data, and then the specific data type. And you can use a variety of these tags to essentially query your data. And another couple of things are there are also a concept called fields, which is also another type of metadata where you can add key value pairs. So you have now the collector name, the source category name, and you also have fields, which will help you in essentially organizing the data. So it's really about how your team views tagging of the data and going forward on that. And now that we've talked about metadata, the reason why we talk about metadata is when I go to the next slide, it's going to be evident why metadata is so important. So keep this slide in mind on how the data flows in, how it's tagged by metadata first. That's the way you would view this slide. Data comes in, you tag it with the metadata you define on the Sumo side, or even on the collector side. Like if you're using OTel, sometimes, you specify that in the collector configuration file. Then you have the field extraction rules where you can create rules to create that metadata. So you don't have to go in on an individual source level. And we're going to be talking about field extraction rules down the road. But then we also can do things like processing rules where we define what data even flows into Sumo. And then we can finally write queries on this data after it's been processed by these multiple steps. Hopefully that makes all sense. Now, we've talked in a high level of the importance of these topics, and now we're going to be going into more detail upon each topic. So query basics. Now that you have an idea of what metadata is, why it's important, how to think about it, what are the different ways in Sumo that you can achieve this sort of universal tagging, now we're going to go into the basics of actually writing the query. Now, not to be worried, we usually have a lot of pre-built queries in Sumo. So you might not even have to write a query for the data source of your interest, but in case, you did want to play around with it or write your custom queries, this is my personal favorite slide at Sumo that actually didn't exist when I first joined at Sumo. So someone down the road created it. And since then, it's my to-go slide to explain how a query works. The way I approach writing queries, and I come from a background of SQL, so I try to take that background and try to understand the query language. It's essentially like you have a select star, which is select fields from table, right? In the case of Sumo, you have to build your concept of what a table is. In this case, that particular concept is what we call the scope, which is the very first line you see in the query, where you go in and define the amount of data or the type of data you want to query. And that's where the metadata comes in, because now you can use your metadata tagging with a combination of wildcards to say, give me all of my production data for Apache. So in this case, we are looking at only the labs metadata. But if you look at this query, the scope is saying source category is equal to labs Apache access. And then you're throwing in some keywords. Now, this concept in Sumo is where you're scanning all these logs, and it has the capability to say, well, I want to look at labs data, but I only want to look at a certain subset of data. And in other query languages like SQL, you would use a where condition, but we have this option of keywords, which is actually purposefully put in there because it's more performant. And we're going to be going over why it's more performant later, but that's what defines the scope. Now, the rest of the lines, and we always differentiate the different lines with a pipe character. Well, the rest of the lines now start creating more structure on top of the data. So you've defined, what data you would like, right? And let me see if I can get my annotate tool. Okay. So you've defined what data you would like. And then now we're going to define the structure of that data. So we're going to say, okay, so I want all the Apache data, but now I want to create a structure from that data, which means I want to grab the fields URL and status code. And that's where you create that concept of fields from your unstructured data, where you're saying anything that matches this pattern, I'm going to use this operator called parse to define a pattern that says, look for anything that says get asterisk HTTP and give me these fields. And then the rest is pretty straightforward. So if you're familiar with any query language, we have our where conditions, our aggregations, and then all of that, fun stuff that helps you go in and say, I want to organize and clean and visualize my data in a particular way. So usually the concepts that are a little bit different are the very first two, the way to define scope and the way to define fields. And for those of you joining in, I don't see any questions in the chat or Q&A section, but please remember, if you have any questions, feel free to post them. We're going to be going pretty quickly through topics, so just feel free to let me know. So this is just a sort of another slide on the same thing, but in this particular slide, we're talking about using different operators. So in the case of the previous slide, we had used parse operators, but Sumo offers many different operators. So let's say you have JSON type fields. You don't have to create parsing expressions. Parsing in this sense is creating patterns, but in the case of JSON, there is already a pattern, which is key value. So we take that logic away from you and then say if Sumo recognizes that a log is a JSON, we have an operator that's going to do that for you. And then, the rest is pretty much the same. You have different operators within Sumo that'll help you in aggregating and visualizing. All right, the next topic that I did want to talk about before we proceed is the concept of processing rules. Now, to be really in charge of your data, apart from being able to search the data, you also want to have whatever system you're sending the data, in this case, Sumo, to allow you to create rules on the type of data you want even ingested into the system. Now, this could probably be handled, of course, by your system on what logs you send to Sumo. But let's say there's a fine line of granularity you want to throw, saying, I only want these type of data to go into Sumo, or I want to create a filter to make sure that it's like a catch-all rule. So that's where the concept of processing rules comes in, where you can say, hey, for the type of messages, I'm going to create patterns, as you can see here. Oops. I'm going to create patterns where I'm going to say anything of this format, I want you to either filter it out. And there's different types of rules, like you can hash the data, mask the data. A lot of customers use this to exclude data from going into Sumo, to just make sure that whatever data comes in has some type of filter, like social security numbers. Like maybe for some reason you have a worry that something might slip through. You've already applied it on your end, but you want to do it on Sumo end just to be certain. And that's where those rules come into play. Now, where you put the processing rules is on the source level. And that's what I'm showing here, where you go in and you can say, hey, I want to add a filter. You can give the filter name, like, SSN filter. And then you can go in and you can create regular expressions, sort of like what we see in the slide here, right? And you have different ones based on the type of, whether it's a single line message or multi-line. And the docs usually have really good examples. So you don't have to memorize this, just take a look at some of our documentation, and I can provide a link for that. And it'll help you essentially go in and say, hey, this is the type of data I want to exclude. Now, if I were to explain this regular expression here, what this is saying is it's like, look for multiple lines. That's what this says. Look for dot star. So look at the entire log message, and then look for the pattern that has event code is equal to 5156. And that's pretty much it. That's all that regular expression is doing. So really the main thing that you need to care about is just this event code is equal to 5156. All that other stuff is just a way to capture the entire log message so that you're not missing anything. All right, so that's where the processing rules are. And then you can, just determine the type of filter, the type of action. So, you can go in here, the hashing, the masking, whatever you're trying to do. And these are also going to be important to understand. So just remember that. So I'm going to go ahead and exit here without saving. So just to summarize, till we're at the 9:20 mark, I'm going to continue going for maybe 20 to 25 more minutes, and then leave 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. But so far, what we've talked about is the journey of the log in Sumo. It comes into Sumo. You can define what data comes into Sumo, how you want to tag the data. Now we're going to go into managing the performance of this data, because now you have a ton of data coming in. You want to make sure that whatever data is coming in, it performs well so that the users are able to query their data in a reasonably good way, and good defining the speed at which the results are coming back to you, but also the ease at which you're able to grab the data. Because another aspect is you don't want to miss out on scope. Like if you were to only query a subset of your data, that's a bad experience. So we want to make sure that whenever you're starting, make sure you start and have an idea on how you want to tag that data. And I know I've said this multiple times, but I cannot stress how important it is. And the reason why is because down the road, it becomes a little bit more difficult as you create content on that data if you hadn't properly thought about the tagging effort as you get more and more data in. So that's why it's really important, because all these basics are what your content is built on, like whether it be your monitoring effort, your dashboarding effort, or just simply your search query efforts. Now, these are some basic tips. So we want to make sure you understand what affects the query performance. the first important thing is the volume of data you scan. The volume of data is always going to determine how much data you're scanning. So reducing it to the optimal time range, just specific to that query, is really good, right? The more data time range is there, the more data you're scanning. Again, scope has a huge impact. Try to create keywords filters, right? So like when I go into a query, right, and I do plus new log search. Now, you might not have seen this query UI, or maybe you have, but in here is where you start writing your query, right? So if you do underscore, it's going to give you a list of all of the different metadata that's available. So I'm going to use source category and look for production data, for example. And let's say you only want to look at error keywords. Throw in that error keyword at the top and compare if you throw that in a where condition versus as a keyword, and you will see that the larger volume of data you scan, this keyword is going to give you that much of a benefit, essentially. And if I were to explain this UI, right? So up here you have recent searches. So like whatever you run, you can go back in there. You have the query builder, right? You can go in here, change the configs to say, use the time of when the data came into Sumo versus what Sumo has determined to be the timestamp. This is a little complex topic. We're not going to be going into it too much today, but just know there's a difference between the message time and the receipt time. Because when you do a query search and you come in here, you're going to see that you can technically have the receipt time and the message time having a difference if you haven't set up the parsing of the message time from the log message correctly. So this is like a really good, neat trick to, if you ever want to understand what does Sumo recognize, and Sumo recognizing means what you've set up to recognize as the message time. Maybe you parse it from the log, and what was the actual receipt time. And if you see a delta, it's the first inclination that your logs are not being parsed correctly for message time. And it seems like a simple topic, but there's been so many instances where I've worked with customers where that's what was the issue. And it's so important because if you were to go in and do a search and not know about this option, and maybe let's say a subset of your logs were not getting correctly parsed out, the timestamp, what's happening is you're not querying all of your logs anymore because half of them are not being correctly timestamped. So that in of itself is an issue. So we want to make sure you have those tools and those ideas on how to look for mismatches. And this is that first one where you can toggle between the use receipt time and just take a look at this. And there's a really good doc about it in our Sumo docs, which actually is very good. It talks a lot about the timestamps, how it works, how Sumo does it, how it works off of your browser time, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a small topic, but in my opinion, it's a very important one that a lot of people need to understand. Now in the UI itself, you're going to see that it tells you the status, whether it's done gathering the results, how long it took, how many results are back. And this is session ID, which you might not really use, but like, let's say you open a support ticket and you're having issues with the performant query. If you give this to our support team, they're able to help you look at the backend and see what's affecting the query. So it's just like a neat trick to know. And it also tells you different information about, the searches, and it also gives you information about the load, right? Is this a heavy query? So like if you're talking about performant queries, you can take a look at this to really understand why is my query taking so long? Maybe the load is super high, and that's where all of these topics we're talking about will help you. Going into the actual message, right? This is the raw message. You have all of these hidden fields, and the hidden fields are basically going to come up two ways. If you have a JSON, Sumo automatically understands that if it's a valid JSON, it'll automatically extract the fields if you have that flag switched on. But in order to get more hidden fields, we have the next topic, which is called a field extraction rule. And we're going to be talking about that. But essentially, if you recall our earlier slide, when we're doing a logs query, right, and you want to extract fields, right, like the concept of a log level or an error level, maybe the concept of an IP address, you can take those parsing expressions and instead of using them in the query and writing queries on demand, you can throw them into a rule, which we call the field extraction rule. And what it does is as the data flows into Sumo, it essentially parses that data out. And that's what we call the field extraction rule. And it's part of our efficiency best practice, because if you think about it, if you have all of the fields that you care about extracted at the time of ingest, it's definitely going to impact the performance of the query, because now you're not having to scan the query and then extract the data and then do all of your aggregations and all of your filtration. So it's like a best practice for, queries and fields that you find some importance in having kind of mapped out. So we talked about the first three. I'm going to leave partitions topic to the end, because I do want to walk you through the field extraction rules. So where you can find all of your logs data management is under manage data and logs. And it has all of these topics that we were talking about, right? The fields, the field extraction rules, the partitions, the schedule views. Those are the four we're going to be talking about today. But you can go in here and you can see the fields that are in your environment. So like, let's say there's a field that you used on one of your collection sources called environment. You can come in here and you can see exactly which sources how many sources are using that field, and where they're being used in field extraction rules, and all of this like information is given to you. And then you can go into field extraction rules and create the actual rule itself. So remember I was telling you, if you have a JSON, Sumo can automatically, parse out the fields. You can set that up here essentially. So you can see this JSON auto parsing. That's where you would set that up. Now, I'm going to use a rule example here. I like to use Apache just because it's very simple, but let's say you want to parse out all of your Apache logs at ingest time. So what you would do is you would click add rule. You would determine the ingest time. You would give it the scope. In this case, you would do like Apache, for example, and then you can use parse templates. Now, this is really important, because the reason why we don't enable field extraction rules is we don't want to use up, there is a limitation to the number of fields and the field extraction rules for an account. So we want to make sure that you're using this for the data sources that are of interest to you, or that you might care about, or the ones that you're even bringing in. So we give you access to the different pre-parsed templates, because we don't want you to go back and figure out, how do I parse out an Apache log? So we give that to you. And I like to use these templates sometimes just to see the expression. So you can see, right, they write the parsing expressions for you. It tells you how many fields have been extracted. So it's extracting the source IP. And essentially, if I were to explain to you how to use this, you can technically grab a parsing expression, go back in here, and I'm going to change the scope to Apache. I'm going to remove this keyword. And you can just literally throw this in here. And all this is doing is it's saying, I'm going to use the parse operator to create a regular expression of this type. And if you're familiar with regular expressions, all it's saying is I'm going to use a field called source IP that follows this pattern. That is 3 digits, 1 to 3 digits, followed by a dot, followed by 1 to 3 digits. And if I hit enter, you're going to notice that it's going to parse out any IP addresses it sees. So it parses that field out that we have there. And then it's also going to exist as a displayed field. So you can go in here and then you can see the breakdown, right? This is like a preview version. You can see the breakdown of IP addresses. You can do things like top values where you don't even have to write a single line of query. It'll create the query for you. And you can see that you can do a count of the source IP. And there's a little new tab called aggregates that comes in and shows you all of the IP addresses, their counts, and of course, it's over the time period. So anytime you're writing a logging query, the 3 things I check your filter, check your scope, check your time range, and check your timestamp, receipt time. Like if you're not sure or the results aren't matching up, those are the 4 things I would check personally. And that's mainly for improper queries, or you're not getting the results you expected. For performant queries, remember, look at the load. Look at the filters, the keywords, the way you've written the query, and maybe check out the field extraction rules over here. So I'm going to pause really quick. I don't see any questions, but I'm going to give you a second to kind of absorb what we've been going through. So far we talked about the logs, tagging of the logs, how the logs come into Sumo, how you can, drop logs if you don't need them based off of processing rules, how we can essentially parse the logs at time of ingest, create rules around them. And finally, how you can write a query and use the UI to essentially write queries for you without even having to, type anything. All right, so I don't see any questions. I'm going to continue. So we talked about all of these different things. Now I'm going to go into the topic of partitions before I jump back into this with more examples. So another very, very important topic of logging, and I cannot stress how important this is how long the data is retained in Sumo Logic. Because the validity of a query is also going to be very dependent on the time range that you're searching for. So if you're trying to create queries that look back 60 days using you can technically do that. You can of course run queries that are longer time range. They might not be as performant, but we have some topics like schedule views that help you with that aspect. But all of those, in order to get that performance and the correct validity of the queries and the search results is going to be how long you store that data into Sumo. And that's where partitions come into play. So let me go into my UI here, and where you can find that is under manage data logs again, and under the partitions. And this is really where the master driver of how long data is stored into Sumo comes into play. So you can come in here and you can see what is the retention period set. So you can see 60 days, 30 days, 200 days. So if you can understand by this, essentially you can take your data, you can divide it, and you can say, I want this data to be stored for a longer time period than this data. Maybe that's your compliance requirements, or maybe that's just your overall requirements. But you have the flexibility, and it drives back the point which I was talking about earlier is you need to have an idea of how you want to tag your data, because if you want to even apply retention period or data forwarding to an S3 bucket, you need a reasonably well thought out way to tag that data. So here you can see, right, all CloudTrail AWS logs, or for the case of Carl, he put his name in there. So all of his logs are going into a different data tier and a partition, and they're being retained for a shorter time period. So you can do a lot with partitions from the perspective of retention, from data forwarding. But the reason why we're talking about partitions is because we're talking about performance. So when you first, let's say this is your new Sumo Logic environment, all your data is technically sent to one partition. It's called a Sumo Logic default. You cannot delete that one. I haven't tried, but I'm pretty sure they won't allow you to. I wouldn't recommend trying it either. You don't want to screw up things, but essentially all the data goes into the Sumo Logic default, and we give customers the flexibility to create new partitions. Now, there is a limit on the number of partitions you can create, so just keep that in mind whenever you're creating a partition. But the reason why you would create a partition is also for performance. So let's say there is a data source, right? Like, let's say Akamai data. Let's say it consumes 30% of your total ingest. So maybe you're having 900 gigs flowing in, and of that, 300 to 200 gigs are just Akamai data. What happens is if all of your data, all that 900 gigs daily, if it's flowing into a single index, and let's say you have another tiny data source called Apache, that's maybe only 50 gigs. What happens is if you're throwing all your data sources into one partition, like the Sumo Logic default, and let's say on a daily basis, you have 900 gigs, and even if you were searching the last 24 hours, and you say, give me the Apache data for the last 24 hours, you would think that you're only scanning only the Apache data because you threw in your keywords and your source category. But what happens is it's now in an index that has so many Akamai data logs that it's not going to be as performant as if you were to separate it out into its own partition, because technically all your data is dumped into the same index. So what we're doing is we're indexing your data. That's what a partition is. It's essentially an index. So in that case, the recommendation would be take all of your Akamai data and create a partition where you say, hey, I want to throw all my Akamai data, and we're not going to be talking about data tiers right now, but you can choose different data tiers based on your subscription plan, right? And then you can give a routing expression. And that's where, again, that concept of metadata comes in. And you can come in and say, okay, I want to throw all of my Akamai data Like maybe you have environment that you care about, so production perhaps. And then you can apply a different retention period. And when you save that partition, I'm going to discard this, it's going to start sending all your Akamai data into that new partition. And Sumo essentially has, when you put it in a different index, it knows that it's in its own index. So it scans only that index where that data is. Now, of course, the data has to be in that index for the time range that you're querying it for. So maybe it takes some time because you just created the partition. But that's why the importance of creating partitions early on is important, especially if you know the volume of your data, because as the logs flow in, now you can manage the performance and the expectations of how that query is to perform for that data source. So that's the reason for partitioning, right? That's why you would want to do that. So this is a really good doc. I'm going to put this in the chat. But you can kind of see they create a subset of data in your account. It's central to search optimization. Results are being returned more quickly and efficiently because the search runs against a smaller data set. That is key. Our entire performance topic is to make sure that your search is running not on necessarily a smaller data set, but the data set that you need. And if you're scanning more data than you need to, you're defeating the purpose of, using a platform which can help you get really good results. So we want to make sure you understand these topics so that you can use them for the future. Now, there's a lot more stuff in this doc, but those are the things that I was mentioning about the limitations on the number of partitions per account. So when you're partitioning, keep that in mind, right? You don't want to create a bunch of partitions unnecessarily. Now, of course, you can deactivate them. So like, it's not like once you do 50, you're done. You can deactivate and reactivate, but also remember, once you use a partition name, it's an index. So you can't reuse that name. So I've had customers who've created versionings, right? Like Akamai version 1.0. So those are like small things, but they actually make a big difference down the road. So I would say that's a really good topic. Another topic for field extraction rules, I'm going to put the link in the chat as well. It's pretty much what we talked about, nothing specifically different, but there is those limitations that you always want to be aware of. If you have multiple field extraction rules on the same set of data, we can't really guarantee like which one gets applied first. So like if you have a FER that works off of another FER, we can't guarantee that FER will run first and then the second one, just because as data flows in, that the flow of data, there's no like, hey, we want this one, this one, this one. The same FER within like the logic within one FER can be controlled, but multiple FERs working against each other on the same set of data can't be really guaranteed. Now, another thing I want to call out as we're talking through these topics is for every topic we're talking about, there's always these really great micro lessons that we intersperse between our docs. So sometimes I personally don't like reading docs if I'm on a crunch. So these micro lessons are really great. They sort of walk you through whatever I'm doing. So take a look at those. All right. So we talked about the tips for efficient queries. So let's see. Another couple of things, and we talked about this, right? When you're writing a query, try to keep the filtering, if you can, to a keyword, to the scope. And you might wonder why, like, if you can have a where clause, why do you need to have it as a scope keyword? The way that I've understood it, right, is if you go in here and let's say you're looking for the keyword error, technically having a where condition accomplishes the same thing, right? You can say where, and I don't know if you know this, but you can query the raw log message. This is not performance, so I wouldn't recommend it if you're writing actual queries, but you can do things like this where you can take the whole raw log message and you can say, look for the keyword where raw matches error. But the reason why we recommend this, and you can have both, right? You can do both things. But the reason why we prefer having it up at the top as an option is because this scope immediately drops any logs that don't match or match whatever you're putting in here. So what happens with the where condition is all the scope is already built. So you're doing a second scan of sorts to look at the query results and then do the where condition. So if you can drop out logs that have error or only look at logs that have error, then that makes your life a little bit easier. So that's what the filtration here, filter before aggregation. It matches, exact matches are faster than wildcard. So these are just little tips and tricks. Most of the times, depending on your query, you might not even need to apply these if it's a smaller one. But if you do start seeing like, when I'm writing a query, I don't immediately go in and, start doing every single thing, right? I try to see what starts helping the query. And if I see issues, that's when I sort of start to say, okay, let me try this, let me try this. And then once I'm satisfied with my query, then I move forward. Now, of course, as you're writing the query, aggregations are going to help. Aggregated queries run the fastest. So always try to create some type of aggregation. And of course, high cardinality will impact it. But a raw query search like this will take longer than an aggregated one. So always doing some type of aggregation like a count by, something, et cetera, is always good. And we have access to cheat sheets within the UI. So like, let's say you come in here and you're like, I don't know what operator Sumo has. If you go in here, they'll give you general examples for like log operators. And we have a lot of log operators. I haven't used all of them even, but there's so many out there. So I would recommend going through these. And you don't have to go through all of them, but it gives you really good examples of how to do keyword expressions and all of that stuff. So other topics, we talked about field extraction rules, the JSON, all of those things. So I'm not going to go into that too much. We talked about partitions, how they index separately and how they're really powerful in combination with FERs. Indexed views. This one is a topic that's very, very, very interesting. So we have partitions that do indexing, but there's also a concept of where you can take a set of data, you can aggregate the data, and then you can backfill it. What that means is, let's say you're trying to query 100 days or maybe 6 months worth of data. If you were to write a raw query that goes back 180 days and try to run it, it'll run, but it might take a really long time depending on the data you have. So when we talk about performance, and let's say your use case is you want to run queries for a longer period of time, I would highly recommend, apart from all the top things we talked about, to look at schedule views, because schedule views give you, I think, some of the best performance when you're writing queries for a longer time range. Because in the case of schedule views, you can essentially go back and, like, let's say in this query that we were doing, let's say count by IP address status code, right? So let's say you're monitoring status codes. I'm going to remove this. Let's say you're monitoring status codes and you're monitoring it for, oh, this query will take forever if I do that. So let's say we're trying to monitor this for 180 days. What you can do is you can technically take this query, and instead of writing a raw query, what you would do is you would create a schedule view for it. So you would call it Apache status code. You throw the query in here. You can determine the start date. So like, let's say you want to backfill this. That's what I meant by backfill. Let's say you want to take data from March or January. You can do that. You can determine how long you want the data to stay. So maybe I want to keep it for 180 days. What this will do is this query will run for some time because you are backfilling it. So it won't be available immediately, but it's going to run this query for the period that you care about. And then after it's done, it's going to give you a little green checkbox. But now what you can do is you can go in here and let me see what data they have in here. I don't know if half of these work. This is our test demo account. But yeah, I think you can go in here. And the query now is not going to be like the query you originally wrote like this. It will be going off of the view name. So if you see here, you're no longer writing the raw query, but looking at the results of the view. And that's how you access the results of that query that has been backdated. So now in the query, you can see that I only counted by status code. So the view only gives you information about the status code and the counts and the time range for when that value was added on. So what that means is you can now use the results of this, and you can see how quickly it returned the results. And that's the beauty of the schedule views. It's very, very, very powerful. And we have really good docs on this. And for today's session, it is a little bit of a complex topic. But I would say if you feel like you need a particular topic for any of the future brown bag sessions, just send an email to Lisa or myself, or just put it in the chat and we can see how we can accommodate that. But there's a lot of complex topics that will take a little bit more time than the general logging session, but they're really important to understand, especially if this is your use case, for example. So schedule views, really, really cool topic. I've gotten really crazy with them sometimes to do some really crazy stuff for customers, and it works really good. So a lot of cool different operators available, but definitely check this out on if you need to pre-aggregate your data for a larger time period or improving search performance in general. All right, so that was indexed views. Now we have only 12 minutes left. So I am trying to conclude the session so we can give 10 minutes at least to Q&A. So I'm gonna pause here and just see if there's any questions. And while I wait for the questions, instead of just waiting in silence, I will be talking about something else that I did want to talk about. So feel free to enter your questions in the meantime. But there is one last topic I really want to talk about, and that's our app catalog. So we talked about all of the querying and all the things we can do, but you don't have to write the queries yourself, right? If there's a data source that we already have an integration for, Sumo writes those for you, and they introduce it in the form of content called apps, where you have searches, you have dashboards where the searches are they're sort of organized in a really neat way. And that's essentially what we have in the app catalog. So you can go in and, like in the case of Apache, right? You can go in and say, hey, I want to take Apache and I'm going to take the classic app. And then what you would do is gives you links to the documentation, but you can also see a preview of the dashboards and how they appear. And all of these panels essentially have queries underneath. So the way I advocate for the app catalog is it's a template. It's really a way for you to understand how queries are written by the Sumo Logic team. So when I go and save this, and this is again another important topic, because the dashboards, when you're setting them up, you are linking them to the data source of your interest. So if you want a separate folder for your production Apache data and your dev, for whatever reason, you can specify that in the scope. And that's what, so imagine like the dashboards as a template, and the scope is undefined, because the dashboards take whatever you enter here and enter that into the panel query. So whatever I put here as Apache, right? I'm gonna save it in my personal folder. Whatever you put here is going to be interspersed into your Apache folder. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And then when you do next, it's going to show up under my personal folder. And then I can open that up and you can see logs and metrics. So you can technically collect logs and metrics for Apache data. We're focusing on logs for now, but when you open up a dashboard, right? Let's see, visitor locations. Now, if you were to go in, now if this dashboard pops up immediately, especially if you have everything set up correctly, like the collection portion, and dashboard troubleshooting is very similar to how you would write a query. You want to make sure that, you know, when you're writing a query, you know that everything is set up correctly. The reason why a dashboard wouldn't work is because the query just can't run, or the query is running and there's no data. So if like you have issues with dashboards, always check out a query in the backend. So the way I usually do it is I start from the top. So I go in and I delete everything and I run this query again. Like, let's say this doesn't work. I check the scope, and sometimes it's just the scope that's an issue. So, you know, whatever I entered in the first screen, that's what gets entered here. And then let's say my dashboard doesn't work for whatever reason, I check a query. I go through the query step by step, right? It could be the where condition. It could be the parsing is messing up with it. It could be the keyword filter. So I just start reverse engineering this. I start deleting it, running the query, and see what was missed in it could be a Sumo side mess up, or it could be that the data you're trying to bring just doesn't match the dashboard, because the dashboards are built specifically keeping in mind certain criteria. Like you need the data to be of this type, this type, this type, the version of Apache, we want the data collected in this particular way. So it could go multiple ways, but I would just, the way I usually approach it is I just delete one line by one line and just go through it. But yeah, that's the app catalog. Sometimes when I was learning Sumo in the beginning, I actually didn't even have data, but I would just download these apps, give it like a dummy data source. And what I would do is I actually pour through the queries, just trying to understand how they wrote these queries, because that's like your biggest library, in my opinion. But there's a lot of integrations and there's a lot of documentation that you can link to it. All right, so we only have 7 more minutes. I think I covered everything I wanted to for today's brown bag logging session. So I'm gonna just hang out for a couple more minutes. I don't see anything in the chat or the Q&A. So I think Lisa and I will be hanging on for the next 5 minutes or to 7 minutes, just trying to see if there's any questions.
Yep, that's right. We'll hang out if you have any additional questions. Bhargavi, in the app catalog, the next gen apps versus the classic apps, those are what we have that are compatible with OpenTelemetry, right?
That is right. So if you go in here and if you were to take a look, you can see they're all labeled with OpenTelemetry. So that's essentially the difference. It's just the type of apps and the type of data that we're expecting.
Oh yeah, it literally says OpenTelemetry.
Yeah, so that's why, like when I did a search for Apache, you can see there's a next gen app and a classic one. And that's just depending on how we collect the data. Yep. And they will give you the link to the documentation for the Apache OpenTelemetry collector, and they also show you the collection. Like I personally, more than reading any doc, diagrams do it for me. So this was very, very helpful. So you can see how you can collect logs and metrics using the different receivers. Mm-hmm. Okay, Bhargavi, I think we could go ahead and call it. Doesn't look like there's any other questions. Thank you so much for walking us through all that. That was a lot of helpful content. Of course. Thank you everyone for joining today. Have a great day.